In March 2013, one of Florence's most important yet lesser-known museums will be closing for extensive renovations. So if you haven't visited the masterworks in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, now's the time to take a visit. Although it holds some of Florence's most important masterworks, like the Gates of Paradise by Lorenzo Ghiberti and Michelangelo's Pietà, the museum is one of the city's less popular, counting just 80,000 visitors per year. It is a must-stop, however, among the more cultured visitors and tourists to the city who know and can appreciate the masterworks it conserves. Unfortunately for them, the Museo dell'Opera di Santa Maria del Fiore is set to close the week after Easter, which falls at the end of May this year. It will be closed for just over 2 years until October 2015, during which time it will be enlarged extensively. Director of the museum, Monsignor Timothy Verdon, tells us how the museum will change.
As most people will have seen in the press, the Opera del Duomo, the Cathedral Foundation, has embarked on a very ambitious project, and it is that of dramatically enlarging the existing museum, which is not very small, but is a medium-sized museum, really inadequate to the kinds of works that we have. We have very large marble and bronze statues, mainly, that come from the exterior of colossal buildings. And to situate such works in the relatively small rooms of the existing museum really is not a help to their presentation, is not a help to people who want to understand how they were supposed to be perceived, what their message was. And so in 1997, the Opera del Duomo acquired a building right next to the existing museum, which in the last stage of its existence was known as the Center City Garage, Garage del Centro, but which really was built in the late 18th century as a theater. And so we have this very large theater hall, fortunately now stripped of all the traces of its 18th century decoration. And in that large hall, we can create a kind of simulation of Piazza del Duomo. The hall is more than 100 feet long, and on that long wall, we can create most of the old facade of the cathedral. In its actual dimension. It had never been carried higher than a third of its height. We know what it looked like from a 16th century drawing. There will be a Titanic wood model made on the basis of that drawing, into which we will insert the statues that we have in great abundance. A significant part of our collection is the sculpture made for that facade, which itself was dismantled, the facade, in 1586. And so we will recreate it, we'll put the statue back where it was intended to be. This is how you should allow monumental art to be seen in an architectural context similar to, or in this case almost identical with, what it was made for. In front of that recreation or evocation of the original facade, we will be able to put Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise, which when he created them for the baptistry in the early 15th century, he imagined they would always stand in front of that facade. So the context for his Gates of Paradise was, in his mind and in the mind of the patrons of those 15-foot tall bronze gates with stories from the Old Testament, the richly carved, albeit then still unfinished, and indeed always unfinished, facade of the cathedral. In the next 10 years or so, almost certainly the other two bronze doors of the baptistry, the earlier doors by Ghiberti and the bronze doors by Andrea Pisano, the 14th century doors, will also be replaced on the baptistry itself by copies, restored, and then come into the museum. So we really will be able to recreate the grandeur and the interrelationships, the interaction of medieval and early Renaissance and late Renaissance art. We'll have the colossal statuary groups made to stand above the baptistry doors, and ancient art, because the two very large classical sarcophagi that for centuries stood in Piazza del Duomo, and which are now in our warehouse because they're too big for the museum, will also come into that space. Then the rest of the collection in entirely new settings. Just to give you one example, the two cantorie, or singing galleries, by Luca della Robbia and Donatello, which today simply stand in a room with other 15th century sculpture, as if their only meaning were that they're masterpieces of 15th century sculpture, will now be put back into something like the true setting, A 16th century music lectern will stand between them. A late 15th century crucifix will adorn the wall at the end of the room. There will be illuminated music books in that room, vestments in that room. They were made to stand above the altar in the cathedral. They're not merely sculpture, they're part of the beauty that was meant to accompany the celebration of the liturgy. So they'll be put back into a liturgical context. Michelangelo's Pietà, which today stands in far too small a space for so large and so important a work, will have an entire room entirely to itself, large enough to allow large groups of people to assemble in front of it, to walk around it, and so on. It would take hours to describe the whole new installation, but perhaps these few examples will give our viewers an idea of what we're trying to do. We're trying to reinsert the works in the drama, in the emotional and even physically movemented context for which they were intended.
A part of the museum will be open to visitors, however. This area will display the Gates of Paradise and Michelangelo's Pietà. There will also be a multimedia guide explaining the very ambitious renovation project. Approximately 30 works in the museum's collection will tour the world during the period of closure, starting with the United States. They will then move on to other locations throughout the world. So if you live in Florence or will be visiting soon, make sure you visit the Museo before it closes.